Out of a treacherous winter sky, a Boeing 737 crashes into Washington, D.C.'s 14th Street Bridge.
I just remember 1 minute sitting in my jump seat, and then the next instant, I'm somewhere else.
A rescue helicopter is in the air within minutes.
Time was ticking, and we were like, come on, hurry, hurry, let's go, let's go.
Witnesses to the disaster acted immediately.
They were hurt, and they needed help very, very badly.
Efforts to save them inspired valiant acts of bravery by true heroes on the Potomac. Washington, D.C. was used to an occasional winter snowstorm. But on January 13th, 1982, the city found itself in the midst of a blizzard that by noon had blanketed the nation's capital with nearly 12 inches of snow. Around 1:30 p.m., Washington's National Airport was closed for snow removal. Incoming flights were canceled, and outgoing planes were put on a 2-hour hold, while ground crews struggled to clear the only acceptable instrument runway. Some airlines canceled flights. Others continued to board passengers so they would be ready for takeoff when the runway was cleared. Air Florida went ahead and began boarding passengers on Flight 90 to Tampa. They started with those seated at the back of the plane. Joe Stiley, an executive at GTE, was also a licensed pilot. He was more than a little concerned about the weather, but he and his coworker Nikki Felch took their seats in row 18. Alice Darden was looking forward to a relaxing vacation in sunny Florida. Arlen Williams, a bank examiner, was on his way home from a business trip. Bert Hamilton, who had a fear of flying, sat in the smoking section, even though he had been trying to quit. Flight attendant Kelly Duncan was 22 and the most junior member of the 5-person crew.
None of the passengers expressed concern at that point about the weather. People were concerned about delays as far as their schedules went, but at that point, I didn't hear anyone that was frightened or anything.
Just before 3 p.m., National Airport was reopened. The tower radioed the captain and said he was in 11th place for takeoff. Regulations required that planes that had been sitting out in the storm and collecting snow receive extra de-icing, a pressurized mixture of hot water and antifreeze. While they sat on the tarmac, the pilot and first officer made a final check of the aircraft's systems.
Pitot heat. On. Anti-ice. Off.
The pilot, who previously had some unsatisfactory grades on proficiency checks, failed to activate the engine de-icers.
Warning panel.
This oversight meant that slush and frozen debris would remain in the engines, hampering a probe vital to monitoring engine power.
All right, ready to taxi.
Just a little more than an hour after its scheduled departure, Flight 90 was cleared for takeoff. Kelly Duncan made one last check of the passengers, then took her assigned seat at the rear of the plane.
When the pilot finally came on the intercom and said, "Flight attendants, be seated for departure," I was really glad to be going. When we started down the runway, it seemed very routine.
But it wasn't that routine. The captain and the first officer had only flown together for less than 18 hours, and their experience in bad weather was minimal.
Immediately after leaving the ground, the plane started to shake. When the passenger turned around and looked at me, he looked like he was looking to me for reassurance, and I kind of shrugged my shoulders and tightened my seatbelt, thinking, everything's okay. I really didn't know what was happening.
The captain advanced the throttle, but the plane wasn't responding normally.
I don't think that's right.
Because the pilot forgot to activate the internal engine deicers, a probe had frozen. Unbeknownst to them, they were operating with only 70% of available power. The plane was not climbing quick enough. The pilot tried to coax it. The frozen aircraft could not achieve altitude.
There's Larry! Larry! We're going down! Look out!
National Airport is very close to the heart of Washington, D.C., and the 14th Street Bridge is one of the busiest thoroughfares. But because of the snowstorm this day, government offices and schools had closed early, so traffic on the bridge was extra heavy. Lenny Skutnik was trying to get home from his job at the Congressional Budget Office.
Traffic was not moving. It was just crawling, going very slow.
Administrative Assistant Jeanette Bigelow was nervous. It was her first time driving in a snowstorm.
The weather was getting worse and worse. The snow was coming down. It got real bad. I remember praying and telling God to take me home.
Sheet metal mechanic Roger Olean was on his way home from his job at St. Elizabeth's Hospital.
The truck I was driving was very old. The battery was about dead. I was afraid to turn on the heater because I didn't want to drain the battery too much, and I couldn't even get the radio to work. So I wanted to get home.
And then the unimaginable happened.
Everybody bend over and tuck. Bend over and tuck.
Get down, put your head down. Keep your head
At 4:01 p.m., after being airborne for only 24 seconds, Air Florida 90, with a total of 79 passengers and crew on board, slammed into the 14th Street Bridge. It sheared the tops off several vehicles and broke into sections as it crashed into the icy water of the Potomac River. Helpless air traffic controllers watched Flight 90 disappear off the radar screen.
United States Park Police Ward speaking.
They immediately placed an emergency call to Park Police headquarters. They needed to verify that a plane had gone down, and in the bad weather, only a helicopter team could do it.
Attention all units, priority. Attention all units, priority.
Medic Ron Gailey took the call.
Eagle's Nest. Says, I think we're looking for, he says, I know we're looking for a 737. And I almost dropped the phone. I said, oh, you got to be kidding me.
Pilot Don Usher and medic Gene Windsor wasted no time.
Are you declaring an emergency, sir?
Watch all episodes of Ice Pilots. Watch on mobile devices or the big screen. All for free. No subscription required. Download Veely now.
There was a lot of urgency getting that aircraft launched and over there, especially given the conditions. The ice on the Potomac was very thick and it was shore to shore. And we knew that there was no way a boat was going to get in there and get any survivors.
Where?
Commuter Lenny Skutnik didn't see the crash, but the commotion on the 14th Street Bridge got his attention.
We're probably halfway across the bridge and noticed some people looking over the guardrail. As soon as we got within view of the river, we could see what was going on. It's obvious that some type of aircraft had crashed. There's debris and broken ice. It was a mess.
The plane had carried 26,000 pounds of Jet A fuel, which emptied into the river, but there was no evidence of fire. Incredibly, there appeared to be survivors in the water. Passengers Alice Darden, Bird Hamilton, Nikki Felch, and Joe Stiley, along with flight attendant Kelly Duncan, were floating amongst the debris. All had been sitting in the back of the plane.
I don't remember an actual impact where I remember hitting. I just remember 1 minute sitting in my jump seat, and then the next instant, I was somewhere else, and I started moving my body and just bobbed to the surface of the water. My initial reaction was that I was just going to swim out, but I just wanted to hold on to something long enough just to get my thoughts together. And by the time I finally got on to a piece of metal, there was just no way I was going to let go of it. By that time, I was really scared.
Then they saw Arlen Williams, alive, but tangled in cables from the aircraft, which trapped him in his seat.
I was thinking, you know, somebody needs to come and help us. I saw people up on the bridge, and I thought, you know, they're just watching us, and I was really angry, thinking they're just gonna watch die.
Roger Olean had reached the 14th Street Bridge moments after the crash.
I stopped and got out of my car, crossed over the highway, and made my way down towards the river.
Firefighters and paramedics hadn't arrived yet, but bystanders had begun their own rescue efforts.
There were already people on the bank who seemed to be tying something together to make a rope of some sort. But the plane itself was, I would guess, at least 100 yards from the shore, and there'd be no way to get a rope out to the plane. The only other option was just to hop in there and then swim out to the plane. I was overcome by the fact that these people out there in the water were helpless, they were frightened, they were hurt, and they needed help very, very badly. I guess it was just this overwhelming desire to try and do something as opposed to doing nothing, which I just couldn't live with.
The people on shore tied their makeshift rope around Olean's waist. He had volunteered to brave the icy waters.
I knew the water would be cold. I wasn't prepared for exactly how cold it was. It was almost like being electrified. It was just so immediate, and the shock of hitting that cold water. I thought at first maybe I could walk on the bottom of the river in between the ice chunks.
Hang on, he's coming!
But unfortunately, the minute you left the shore, the water was very deep, so there was no walking. The only thing I was focused on was getting out to the plane. I mean, focused to the point where I realized that my hands were so cold I couldn't feel them anymore, and I remember going through my mind, I wonder if I'll ever be able to use my hands again. And just thinking, well, that doesn't matter, I gotta keep going. At about that point, this rope thing that I had tied onto me, they had reached the end of it. and they told me to wait until they tied some more stuff on. And I was pretty cold. I didn't want to wait, but I didn't have any choice at that point. I tried to untie it and get away from that rope, but my hands were too frozen. I couldn't untie it, so I was locked into that, and I just had to wait for them to extend this rope.
It took 15 minutes for the Park Police helicopter to arrive at the bridge. When pilot Don Usher and medic Gene Windsor had left their hangar, visibility was so bad that Usher had to use the tops of streetlights as a guide. But as it turned out, they got a lucky break.
Right as we arrived at the 14th Street Bridge, the weather broke. And just for about 10 or 15 minutes, the ceiling lifted up, the snow stopped blowing, and we could see the whole scene from National Airport all the way up to the 14th Street Bridge. And then the ice became very obvious. We could see that something had hit the river, shattered the ice in all directions, and then there was one spot where there was very little ice, and there was a fuselage, what appeared to be some piece of an aircraft with people hanging onto it.
Only Usher and Windsor had a full view of the disaster below. No one knew how many people were injured or dead on the bridge, nor if the 6 people visible in the 34-degree water were the only survivors of Flight 90. Shortly after takeoff from Washington, D.C.'s National Airport, Air Florida's Flight 90 crashed into the 14th Street Bridge. As the plane went down, it toppled a truck and sliced the roofs off several cars, killing 4 people. Out of 79 passengers and crew on board the plane, only 6 survived the crash. They were now clinging to life in the frozen Potomac River.
I was really kicking my legs and doing everything that I thought would be the right thing to do to keep myself moving, because it just was so painful to be in that freezing water. I was really thinking, I can't help anybody else. There was a woman next to me. She had a life jacket in her hand. I opened it with my mouth. It was in no way any kind of a heroic effort.
Rescue and medical teams fought their way through the immobilized traffic to reach the bridge and the riverbank. They quickly realized they had no way of getting to the stranded survivors in the water. Emergency rescue teams worked frantically to help the injured on the bridge.
Chris has to move back now, too. Everybody on.
The roof of Jeanette Bigelow's car was ripped off.
Mark, can you hear me? You okay? Hang on, I'll be right there.
Miraculously, she was alive.
After that, I don't remember too much after that. Next time I remember, I woke up, I was in the hospital.
The impact of the plane had torn away a 41-foot section of the bridge's sidewall barrier and railing. Bigelow knew she was fortunate.
I believe there is a God in heaven, because if you would see how my car was, it was really messed up pretty bad. Everything was crushed besides the seat I was sitting in.
Down below in the river, the situation was becoming even more critical. The survivors had been in the 34-degree water for over 20 minutes. For flight attendant Kelly Duncan, this was a moment of truth.
You kind of evaluate your life. I was young at the time, but I remember thinking, God is watching this. I thought, why should God help me? Why should He all of a sudden help me? Because I've never given any thoughts about got it all.
Roger Olean, who had been driving home from work when the crash occurred, continued to risk his life in the freezing water. Tied to a makeshift lifeline, he struggled to make his way to the survivors.
I could hear them, but I couldn't see them very well. And I was completely exhausted and completely frozen. I guess it entered my mind that if I keep going, I'm not going to leave this river. And I took a second to think things over, and I could not turn my back on those people out there. So I just made for that last 10 feet. At about that point, maybe I was 5 feet or so away from the plane, I heard a helicopter coming.
Park Police helicopter pilot Don Usher and medic Gene Windsor quickly realized they were the only hope for the survivors of Flight 90.
We had the group of 5, and then one person separated from them by a portion of the fuselage. And we saw one guy kind of flailing around out in the ice by himself. And we went right to that individual, because we figured here's one that's out in the open, so we've got to do something with him right away. At that point, that individual began going backwards towards the shore. And when we looked, he was actually tied up with ropes and all kinds of other objects, and the people on shore were reeling him back in.
By the point that I got pulled back to the shore, my hands, of course, were numb, and so was the rest of me. I couldn't feel much of anything at that point. I reached the bank, and I found right away that I had a lot of trouble walking. And I was shaking so badly I couldn't control it.
Once Don Usher and Gene Windsor saw that Olean was safe, they focused their attention on getting the survivors out.
Gene's job was to decide how to rescue these folks or get them into the aircraft, which we really didn't think we could do because of the circumstances. We couldn't get them inside, so we had to get them from where they were to the shore. My job was to keep the aircraft flying.
Flying low for a rescue was always dangerous, but this one would be even trickier.
So all the time we were moving, we had to watch where we were moving and what was being picked up, because the last thing we needed was debris to come through the rotor system, damage our aircraft, and put us in the water with the survivors.
Passenger Bert Hamilton was closest to the helicopter.
And I was tying a loop in the rope in the helicopter to lift the people out. One of the persons that was in the water came over to the helicopter and threw his arms around the skid.
But the crew knew, given the man's nearly frozen condition, he would lose his grip if they tried to take him back to shore.
And I opened the door and told him, no, you can't do that. Of course, you can't hear one another at that point, but I just told him no, 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 and he understood and let go. And with that, I finished tying the rope and threw him the loop into it and lifted him out of the river.
As they approached the shore, the helicopter rescue team knew they faced another potential danger. They had to hover just above the shoreline in order to transfer the survivors to the ground personnel. But given this low altitude, the rotors might strike one of the people standing on the bank.
And so Don got on the outside speaker and told them to get back, that rotor's going to cut you in two. And it was right about midsection on those people standing up there. He had to keep them back. And it took a heck of a long time to get this gentleman out of the rope because of the precarious footage there on the riverbank.
Bert Hamilton was now on dry land, the extent of his injuries yet to be determined. There were still 5 people in the river clinging to the wreckage. They had been in the freezing water for over 20 minutes And at any moment, any one of them could lose consciousness and go under. An airplane crash in the nation's capital. Air Florida's Flight 90 had gone down moments after takeoff. The wreckage was now floating in the Potomac River, along with 5 remaining survivors. Commuter Lenny Skutnik was on the 14th Street Bridge. He felt compelled to help.
We've all watched things on the news of other people doing heroic things, firemen running into burning buildings. And it makes us question ourselves. Would we ever, in a situation like that, be able to do anything?
Medic Gene Windsor and helicopter pilot Don Usher had been able to get one survivor to shore. They knew that time was working against them. 4 survivors were floating free, but Arlen Williams was hopelessly trapped in his seat amid the wiry debris. The survivors had now been in the freezing water for over 20 minutes.
They just looked dazed and were moving very slowly, just holding onto the wreckage and keeping afloat.
The helicopter crew tried to rescue Arlen Williams next.
This man looked the worst of all the people that were in the water. Had a horrendous blood show on his head. And I threw the rope right on him, and he let it go to the other folks.
Flight attendant Kelly Duncan was rescued next.
I pulled the rope around myself, and it just carried me out. And at no time did I feel, oh, I'm going to fall off. I don't think I can hold on. I just felt that I was being lifted out. I remember hands reaching out for me when we got to the shore. And it was at that point that I really felt like I could just let go, because I knew people had me. There's no way for me to describe that to anybody who has never been in that situation, who really thinks 1 minute that they are going to die. And when someone comes and changes that, you know, there's no way to explain, you know, how appreciative you are.
2 survivors from Flight 90 were now on shore. But pilot Don Usher was afraid that their rescue was taking too long.
It was very frustrating hovering over the shore while they had to get them back out of those ropes. The folks on the shore, they're doing everything as fast as they could possibly do under the circumstances, but it just, to us, it seemed like it was taking forever.
Rescue personnel on the ground threw Windsor a ring buoy with a rope attached. He and Usher could now try to pull out of the water more than 1 survivor at a time.
When we met back the 3rd time, same thing. This man in the middle of the wreckage tried to get him to take the rope, and he just passed it off.
Nikki Felch took the tow rope. Her boss, Joe Stiley, grabbed the ring with one arm and Alice Darden with the other. It was a noble gesture, but his muscles were so cold he could barely hold on.
We couldn't lift them into the air because none of them were secured in a way that they were going to be safe, or they were just going to fall off if we tried to lift them up. So as we began, there was no way to get them across but to drag them across.
Halfway from the wreckage to the shore, the lady with the flotation device on who was on the rope lost her grip on the rope.
Nikki Felch was now stranded in the middle of the river. The life-saving vest barely managed to hold her above the water. Joe Stiley fought to hold on to Alice Darden. The collision with the ice chunks actually broke Stiley's ribs. The stress finally was too much. Darden could not hold on to him, and he lost his grip as well. The helicopter crew continued to drag Stiley to shore, knowing the two women desperately needed help. Usher quickly turned around and went back to pick up Alice Darden.
That's where we knew we were going to have our problems. A combination of hypothermia, injuries, shock, all of those things were kind of really affecting her ability, her perception about where she was and what she was doing.
The 26,000 pounds of jet fuel that had spilled out on impact was floating everywhere. This toxic substance was burning Darden's eyes and blinding her.
When we got closer to try to effect her rescue the second time, I could see the eyes were just blank. They weren't looking up. Then I dropped the throwing ring on the end of the rope and hit her with it a couple times, and she finally took hold of it.
Gene said go, so we began and we pulled her off of the floe, and she held on, but as I got to shore again, I had to lift up to get the rotor system clear of the people that were on the riverbank, and that pulled the grass, and it just kind of slid out of her hands.
Alice Darden could no longer help with her own rescue, and she was losing the strength needed to stay afloat. The sole helicopter that had reached the Air Florida 90 crash site continued to fight inclement weather and the clock. 3 survivors of the crash had now been in 34-degree water for nearly 30 minutes, and no one could predict how much longer they could survive. Arlen Williams, who was trapped in the wreckage, had refused the rescue helicopter's lifeline twice, putting the other passengers before himself. Nikki Felch was kept afloat by a life vest and had drifted to the middle of the river. Paramedic Gene Windsor was trying to get Alice Darden to grab onto a life-saving ring, but she was blinded by jet fuel.
Time was running against this hypothermia. Had no idea what kind of injuries they had, but they had to be pretty substantial. She finally grabbed a hold of the ring buoy, so Gene said go.
However, bystander Lenny Skutnik, who had not given up his vigil, watching and wondering if he had the right stuff, could see that she was in trouble.
I knew she was going to let go, and that was it, that she needed help. It was just too much to take.
Within seconds, Darden lost her grip on the ring.
When she let go of it, she kind of rotated over and was trying to continue swimming, but it was clear she was not going to stay up for very long. We're now at a crisis. What are we going to do with this? How are we going to do this one?
I never really stopped to think about whether I was going to go in or not. It was more of a human instinct type thing. I just did it. As I got to her, it was eerie. It was like you see in a horror movie that somebody's been drowned in a bathtub where their face is just under the water. She was going under. When I grabbed her, I just started pushing and stroking, you know, nothing real fancy, just trying to get her to the bank. And a fireman had a rope tied around him, grabbed her, and then I swam off to the side and made my way up the embankment. I was in a situation where I did something, and I feel good about that I had it in me to help another human being.
There were now 2 survivors left in the water. The helicopter crew had a critical decision to make.
We knew we still had one on the fuselage, but the one on the fuselage we assumed was still secure and was above water. So we had to go for the one that was now open, the one female passenger that had drifted away from the fuselage and that she had fallen off the rope earlier on that try to get them all in at once. So we went for her.
Paramedic Gene Windsor could see that Nikki Felch was exhausted.
Tried a couple of times with her to get her to take a hold of the rope, and she just looked so stunned at that point. I told Don, I said, you know, she's not responding very well. Let's go down and get her.
Windsor stepped out on the icy skid, risking his own safety.
I went probably about this far from her head with the skid of the aircraft, and I watched until there was a piece of ice in front of me that I set the toe of the skid on, this little piece of ice, and looked back, and she was right there with Gene, and then he grabbed her. He pulled her up onto his boot, and he was holding on to the back of her clothing and said, go. We just lifted her right up and took her right back in, because I had a pretty good idea he was just holding on for dear life with that one.
Don did take it up. He got us out of there. And it was a real test for that helicopter, because we'd never done anything like that with that helicopter.
5 survivors were now on shore. The helicopter crew turned around and went for Arlen Williams.
Now we've got one more rescue to do, and that is to go back out to the fuselage and get that 6th person. The aircraft had shifted, it had sank a little bit, it had turned, and we couldn't find him. So we went all the way around the aircraft, hovered around looking specifically to try and see if we could see him even at the water surface, or just below the water surface, and couldn't see him. All we could see was just the mangled, the fuselage and everything laying there, the metal. He was gone.
He was nowhere to be seen. I felt like the Dickens right then. It's just like human nature that people want to get out of that situation, and him passing it off makes you wonder.
Arlen Williams had made the ultimate sacrifice to help his fellow survivors. Windsor and Usher had done all that they could.
The total time from our arrival on scene until the last victim was put on shore was 10 minutes. To us in the aircraft, it seemed like 3 hours.
We got back to the hangar. I called my wife at home. Then I started telling her about the 6th man that we could not rescue. And I just busted out crying right at that point, because unable to effect this rescue. And I still get choked up about it, really.
While the survivors were out of the icy water, they still weren't out of danger.
No, we are full. Okay. We have to find someplace up. I'm maxed out. I'm gonna need some more help back in here.
They were suffering from multiple injuries and severe exposure. Bringing someone back from a hypothermic state has risks of its own. The horrendous crash of Air Florida's Flight 90 into Washington, D.C.'s 14th Street Bridge on a snowy January day had put the staff at National Orthopedic Hospital into disaster mode. They were told that a large passenger plane had crashed. Survivors from the plane and injured commuters from the bridge were on their way. Dr. Gerard Ng, an orthopedic surgeon, was on call.
Our disaster drill was such that we set up the lobby of the hospital as the primary area. The emergency room wouldn't be nearly big enough to be a triage area.
Dr. Richard Schwartz was chief of medicine and the medical disaster coordinator.
We had absolutely no idea of what we were going to encounter that day. We didn't know how many had been killed on the plane or how many had been rescued.
In addition to the 5 plane crash survivors, Lenny Skutnik and Roger Olean, the 2 civilian rescuers who had plunged into the water to help save them, were also brought in.
My immediate reaction was, oh my Lord, if they're bringing 7 at a time, we were going to be overwhelmed very early because it was a small hospital, 125 beds. The sad part about it was that was the first and last ambulance that we saw with patients.
The survivors were suffering from multiple injuries and severe hypothermia.
Extremely hypothermic. I don't have vital signs on anybody.
The overwhelming reaction was how cold these people were. I don't think they were feeling pain really from their fractures. They were feeling the pain of hypothermia.
Flight attendant Kelly Duncan was the only crew member to survive the crash.
I didn't really know of any injuries that I had. I didn't feel pain. I remember shaking and shaking and shaking and just my body just being uncontrollable.
Her temperature had sunk to 81 degrees. She was hovering near death.
Hypothermia is a big problem because the body begins to shut down, and the major aspect of that problem is actually rewarming. We couldn't warm them from the outside because then their core temperature would still remain cold and there would be a differential, and that can cause electrical instability in the heart. You can have cardiac arrest, cardiac standstill.
Bear with me here, hon, okay? Honey, we're going to put a tube down your throat. I need you to help me here.
So we ended up warming the patients by running warm salt water through their stomachs to warm their core temperature.
In addition to hypothermia, most of the survivors had sustained multiple fractures.
Can I get somebody to call X-ray? We need some stat neck and back films down here, spine films.
I need a nurse out here.
These proved to be relatively simple to treat.
The amazing thing was these patients were in shock both from the water and from their trauma. We could pretty much manage their fractures right there without any anesthesia or anything because they were basically anesthetized from the cold water. So we stabilized the fractures, put them in splints, and basically moved them out of that area in a fairly quick period of time.
Alice Darden and Nikki Felch stabilized overnight and eventually made full recoveries. But Joe Stiley and Bert Hamilton required extensive physical therapy to regain their movement.
It was surprising to me that anybody survived that crash. And I think the most noteworthy thing to me was that at least 3 of the individuals, 2 of whom I saw, were in the brace position.
Volunteer rescuers Roger Olean and Lenny Skutnik were treated for hypothermia and released that evening. After 5 days, Kelly Duncan was able to leave intensive care. Because of shock, she did not realize what had happened to her until she heard a news report on television.
I heard him say, Air Florida. And then I heard him say the fact that we had hit a bridge and that so many people had died and they were still recovering bodies. And I just remember just tears just rolling down my face and just filling up my ears because I think that was just the first time that it really registered what exactly had happened, the magnitude of it.
4 commuters died from the crash into the bridge. Jeanette Bigelow was a lucky survivor.
Can you hear me? You okay?
I had like 67 stitches in my head. The doctor told my mother that if it would have been 2 inches deeper, I would have died, because whatever hit my head, it would have hit my skull and it would have killed me.
Miraculous. Her condition was absolutely miraculous. She had some glass injuries to her scalp and a cut on her ear, but was otherwise doing quite well.
Out of 79 passengers and crew on board Air Florida Flight 90, only 6 survived the crash. Through the extraordinary efforts of medic Gene Windsor and pilot Don Usher, 5 eventually made it home.
I'm a helicopter pilot who flew a mission, did what I had to do, got through it, and flew back to the hangar and moved on to the next thing. The hero is the person who's never expected to do it and then does it. Not the person that's paid to do it, not the person that does it and they're trained to do it and they're expected to do it. The hero is the person who it's inside and you don't know it's there until it happens.
Just 2 weeks ago, in the midst of a terrible tragedy on the Potomac, we saw again the spirit of American heroism at its finest. Lenny Skutnik.
I was invited to attend President Reagan's first State of the Union address. Just put me in shock. I was just dumbstruck. To me, it was a very human thing to do. My instincts told me to go help the girl, and that's what I did.
President Reagan also thanked Roger Olean, the first bystander to jump into the freezing Potomac after the plane crash. Like the other heroes that day, Olean downplays his act of courage.
The way I looked at the incident, it was 25 minutes out of the rest of my life. And even though a lot of attention was focused on those 25 minutes, I was pretty much who I was before and after. And I didn't want to get any big ideas about myself or anything that I might have done in that particular 25 minutes. I'm just a guy who did what he thought was the thing to do at the time.
Air Florida passenger Arlen Williams paid the ultimate price for his heroism. In memory of his fatal self-sacrifice by passing up his turn to be rescued until last, the 14th Street Bridge was renamed in his honor. For over an hour, storm chasers follow a terrifying killer as it decimates the Oklahoma countryside.
This is a big tornado, and it's headed right in the direction of Oklahoma City.
Moving to the northeast, over 1 million people lay in its path.
The threat was imminent, and it was a threat like they had probably not experienced.
As it levels entire neighborhoods, rescuers must try to save those in danger.
I knew people were dying. I didn't know how many, but I knew people were dying.
When nature unleashes its terrifying fury, underground is the only safe place to survive at F5. Every year, massive thunderstorms strike Oklahoma from March to July. Thunderstorms that can be a final warning of something much more dangerous to come. Tornadoes. During the afternoon of May 3rd, 1999, at the National Weather Service Forecast Office outside Oklahoma City, meteorologist David Andra was concerned because satellite imagery and Doppler radar showed a massive thunderstorm brewing.
We saw radar signatures that we know are associated with supercell thunderstorms, and those are the types of storms that produce the long-lived, long-track tornadoes.
He realized he had just enough time to issue a tornado warning.
Tornado warning is in effect until 7 p.m. for Oklahoma County. The storm is moving in from the southwest and should be arriving within the next 15 minutes.
On such a warm spring day, few Oklahoma City residents were worried about the possibility of a tornado. Yet the threat of a serious storm led the 4 p.m. news reports.
Good afternoon, glad you're here. I'm Kelly Ogle.
I'm Robin Marsh, glad you're with us this Monday, and we do begin with some potentially dangerous weather across Oklahoma today.
Here we go again. Gary's in the forecast center with the very latest. Gary?
Thank you, guys. Conditions are pretty favorable for some explosive thunderstorm development. In fact, some of that's going on right now. There's going to be a threat of severe thunderstorms, large hail, and the possibility of some tornadoes with these storms this evening.
In the Greenbrier Lake neighborhood south of Oklahoma City, Cecilia Vaughn and her mother Bobby, a school teacher, had just gotten home from work. Bobby was concentrating on grading a stack of test papers, while Cecilia was busy sending email. The TV was tuned to the news, but Bobby and Cecilia paid little attention. It was just background noise. Gary England is the best known of Oklahoma's weather forecasters. He's been Channel 9's meteorologist for 25 years.
Val's trying to talk to you.
Okay, Val, talk to me.
Even with the latest Doppler radar technology, he couldn't be certain that a tornado had touched down. England relied on storm tracker Val Castor to be his eyes and ears.
There's not a radar in existence that can tell you if a tornado's on the ground. But what you have to have is somebody out there that you can call or talk to on the radio and say, for example, Val Castor's one of ours. You can say, what do you see? It's absolutely critical.
Just after 5 p.m., Val saw his first funnel cloud near the tiny town of Cyril, 78 miles southwest of Oklahoma City.
We were out there before the first storms even developed. And we watched the very first storm go up that day. We watched it get stronger, become severe, and then put down a couple of bigger tornadoes after that.
Val's job was to give accurate, timely updates back to Gary at the Weather Center so the public could be warned. Over 1 million people lay directly in the path of the advancing bad weather. Most were still unaware of the rapidly growing danger.
Relax, keep the TV on, we'll keep you advised. Now let's take a look at Viper, and we'll take a time lapse at it. Main storm right now, just now developing very quickly, and it's moving.
In southwest Oklahoma City, John and Dixie Szymanski were planning on a quiet evening home together. The television was tuned to Channel 9's Gary England, but neither John nor Dixie were worried by what was being reported.
I didn't know very much about tornadoes, being from New York. When I first moved here, I'd noticed the warnings and the watches on TV, and I'd paid attention to them when I got nervous the first couple times when I saw them. But then I grew accustomed to them, and I guess I became complacent and didn't pay much attention to them after that.
Form Zone 10, Snyder, update. What do you got, Val?
Okay, it looks like to me, Gary, this thing is rapidly getting organized. The rotation has gotten much stronger. We're probably 3/4 of a mile behind it right now. Gary, we have a tornado on the ground, a brief touchdown. It's 2 miles west of Chickasha, moving to the northeast.
Just after 5:30 p.m., the weather grew suddenly much more dangerous. A large tornado had touched down near the town of Chickasha, 45 miles southwest of the metropolitan area. It was now a violent F2 category tornado, almost 500 yards wide. People were unprepared as the tornado roared into the small downtown. The F scale, or Fujita scale, is used by meteorologists to rate the intensity of a tornado by examining the damage it causes to man-made structures. An F2 is considered a significant tornado with wind speeds up to 157 miles per hour. It was storm tracker Val Castor's first sight of the monster tornado that would soon terrorize Oklahoma City.
After we saw the third tornado that this storm produced, that was a stronger tornado. We knew then that this storm was probably going to get big.
But as quickly as it began, the tornado dissipated. This was not a good sign. Meteorologist Gary England.
The movement of the parent storm, the main thunderstorm, was generally northeast. Each time it cycled, it would strengthen and then it would weaken. Every time it would strengthen again, the tornado would come down larger.
Val was transmitting photos of the approaching storm back to Channel 9. Using a global positioning system, he was able to give detailed locations of the storm's path. These photos were then broadcast live to viewers across Oklahoma.
So Val, let us know if this thing starts to come down again, because we're going to come back here.
After the tornado dissipated, a new wall cloud formed. That wall cloud was much, much bigger, had extremely strong rotation. At that point, we knew that was going to be a big tornado.
Air Force Reserve medical technician Scott Branscombe was trying to ignore the weather warnings and enjoy a quiet dinner with his family.
My mother and my sister were actually a little bit more concerned about the storm than me and my father were. But I wasn't too concerned. It's Oklahoma, it's May, we have tornadoes all the time, and just one of those things you get used to when you live in Oklahoma.
Within minutes, another tornado was spawned. Dirt and debris were sucked up inside as it slowly formed a trail of destruction.
Wow, that is absolutely awesome. This thing is throwing up debris all over the place.
If the tornado continued its present course, it would make a direct hit on Oklahoma City.
Like I say, this thing is just tearing things up. It's, like I say, the funnel is real small. I'd say the funnel might not be any wider than 100 yards.
What I can tell you folks here in central Oklahoma, just take your tornado precautions.
Even as Gary England pleaded with viewers to take cover, Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn continued to ignore the danger. Val had to zigzag through country roads to keep up with the tornado. As he drew closer and closer, he realized its deadly potential.
Yeah, we're getting working our way up to now probably go down. It's huge. I'll tell you what, it's at least an F3 at this point.
It was now a violent F3 tornado with wind speeds up to 200 miles per hour. As the pictures were relayed live to the entire city, Channel 9 weatherman Gary England issued dramatic warnings to residents of southwest Oklahoma City.
Just talk to me about it. Once again, I will go through tornado precautions for you folks down there. Below ground is best. If you do not have below ground shelter, go to the center part of your house.
Oh, Mother, it's May.
Because no one could be certain exactly where the monster tornado would turn next, people were still reluctant to take any precautions.
Okay, so wait, but I can see a little bit of a clear spot working into it right now.
11-year-old Tim Bailey and his parents were heading south to their home after a day of shopping in Oklahoma City. They were unaware of the advancing storms. Meteorologist David Andra issued an emergency tornado statement in one more attempt to get people's attention.
Well, the tornado emergency statement we sent in an effort to heighten the public's awareness that this was an extremely dangerous situation. We wanted to make sure that everyone knew that the threat was imminent, and it was a threat like they had probably not experienced.
Medical personnel immediately prepared for the onslaught, according to Dr. Dale Askins.
We had excellent news reporting. We could see the size of the tornado around the Chickasha area moving towards Oklahoma City. So we knew it was coming, and preparing for that with the large number of casualties was our immediate concern.
Pillows, clothes, coats, anything you can find, and cover up. Stay away from the windows. This tornado is deadly.
You need to be below ground to survive in most cases. It is moving.
Persistent warnings from the meteorologist finally stirred Bobby's interests. She now realized there was a tornado less than 3 miles from their home. Bobby told Cecilia that they must get into the bathroom.
They are deadly. About need to be below ground level to survive. If children that are home, a lot of pillows, a lot of blankets. They get in the bathroom, get in between the school and wall, pack them.
In the neighborhood of southwest Oklahoma City, the growing urgency of the weather warnings and panic calls from relatives had finally stirred John and Dixie Szymanski into action.
We realized the severity of the tornado when one of the local newscasters stated that if you weren't underground, you probably would not survive the tornado.
Val Castor continued north, following the storm that was now only a few miles from residential areas. Police blocked the roads from civilian traffic, and Gary England realized it was now an F5.
I had to say something to get everyone's attention because they've heard thousands of warnings, so I knew I had to say something to get their attention. That was get below ground. This is an extremely intense tornado. And I remember thinking then, a lot of people are going to die.
Oklahoma City braced itself for the full impact of the twister. On the late afternoon of May 3rd, 1999, a series of supercell thunderstorms spawned over a dozen tornadoes southwest of Oklahoma City. But storm tracker Val Castor realized he was not seeing a tornado that could be ignored.
Let me talk to Gary again.
He relayed his concerns about the twister's size and speed directly to Channel 9 meteorologist Gary England, who was broadcasting a minute-by-minute account of the tornado's deadly approach toward the city.
Gary could tell by the tone of my voice and what I was telling him that this was not an ordinary tornado, that this was a large and very devastating tornado. Hey, this thing is not letting up. This is a big tornado, and it's headed right in the direction of Oklahoma City.
As it continued northeast, the tornado moved away from small towns and rural areas. It was now heading directly toward Oklahoma City, where over 1 million people lived. Gary England was very concerned.
Looking at the tornado itself, the video of the tornado, talking to the meteorologist in the field, looking at it on radar, is obviously this was an extremely intense tornado. Didn't know the wind speed for sure, but it was 200 plus easy, and that meant it was probably going to blow away almost everything it encountered. Once I realized this particular tornado was different, I knew I was going to have to use a different type of warning. So what I said basically was, you're going to have to be below ground level to survive. I said, most houses are not going to survive this. So below ground shelter is best.
Unfortunately for many Oklahoma City residents, finding shelter underground was impossible, Although they were initially slow to react, school teacher Bobby Vaughn and her daughter Cecilia had taken cover in their bathroom. Pillows were all they had time to grab and became their only protection against the impending storm. In the neighborhood of southwest Oklahoma City, John and Dixie Szymanski had taken shelter in their closet. For 5 long minutes they waited, clinging to each other. The announcements on the television plotted the tornado's grim march toward their new home.
Dixie and I were talking about how much we loved each other just before it hit. We were praying.
In the span of 20 miles, as the tornado moved from the rural community of Chickasha to the more developed subdivision of Bridge Creek, it had grown to be almost a mile wide. It had also evolved into the most lethal classification on the tornado scale, an F5 with 300-mile-per-hour winds.
The tornado appeared to reach its maximum intensity about 318 miles an hour. Usually a hook echo on radar that indicates a tornado is filled with precipitation. The hook echo was filled full of houses and debris and cars in the air. It was a horrific experience because I knew people were dying. I didn't know how many, but I knew people were dying.
As tornado sirens began going off around them, Scott Branscombe and his family realized their home lay directly in the tornado's path. With no basement, they knew the next best thing was to take shelter in an interior room or a bathtub. To cover them from falling debris, Scott and his father dragged a mattress into the bathtub.
But it was just get everybody, into the bathroom, get everybody safe, and just get ready for what may or may not happen.
11-year-old Tim Bailey and his parents were driving home when they saw the tornado out of their window. They jumped out of their car and ran up to an overpass beneath the interstate, thinking it was a safe place to take cover from the storm. The tornado had been zigzagging as it moved into the city, complicating accurate prediction.
Gary.
Yes.
We're back within about half to 3/4 of a mile of it now. It's directly north of us.
Yes.
I think it's on the interstate right now.
Tim Bailey crawled into the overpass for shelter. His mother protected him with her own body. She held on as long as she could while the tornado blew right over them. As emergency vehicles responded, it was difficult to determine the full extent of the damage the tornado had left behind in its wake. Scott Branscombe and his family now feared the worst. With the sound of the storm now a deafening roar, Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn could do nothing but wrap their pillows tighter around their heads.
Here it comes. Oh no.
At 6:40 p.m., the big twister hit the neighborhood of Moore. A swirling cloud of razor-sharp debris, it shredded everything in its path. As it crossed the interstate highway, the mile-wide tornado made a direct hit on John Szymanski's new home.
Right as it hit, we felt a strong sensation of wind and air at our feet. At that point, I knew we were probably going to be in some trouble, just due to the fact that we're in an interior room. There was no ventilation in the closet coming from the floorboards. At that point, we realized that the house was coming apart and it was disintegrating around us.
As the massive tornado finally hit, the Szymanski's home exploded, and his young wife's hand was torn from his grip. On May 3rd, 1999, an F5 tornado with 300-mile-an-hour winds slammed into the suburbs surrounding Oklahoma City. It destroyed everything in its path. For storm chaser Val Castor, a mile-wide tornado was a frightening sight.
We were probably about a half a mile away from the tornado, and I looked out the windshield and looked straight up, and there was a large piece of debris. I don't know what it was. Could have been a car, could have been a roof of a house, but it was straight above us, about a half a mile up in the air.
It crossed the interstate, leaving a trail of death and debris in its wake. No one had seen anything like it before. Meteorologist David Andrew was among them.
This was the first time that I can recall that I genuinely had some personal fear or fear for my family or friends that they were in the path of a long-track, violent tornado.
Rescue personnel were beginning to realize how violent and dangerous it was.
I mean, we got hurt. We got 2 hurt, we got 1 missing.
Tim Bailey was dazed. His father was injured. His mother was missing. She had held on to him as long as she could, but when the tornado threatened to consume them both, she let go to save her son. EMT Jeremy Walker was one of the first on the scene.
The boy appeared to be in shock about everything that had just happened, and he continued to be that way pretty much the whole ride to the hospital.
As the tornado moved past the interstate into the heavily populated metro area of Oklahoma City, over 1 million people lay in its path. Air Force Reserve medical technician Scott Branscombe and his family had taken cover in the bathroom. For many Oklahoma City residents, an interior room was their only protection. With the tornado almost upon them, Scott couldn't resist one final look outside. Now, barely 500 yards away, came a coal-black wall of swirling debris. The noise was deafening.
I went outside and turned back and saw this black twisting wall, just this black mass, and it was just unbelievable. I couldn't find the words to explain what it exactly looked like. It was just a big black wall of noise.
But his parents' home lay in the possible path of the tornado. As they took shelter in their bathroom, they could hear the thundering sound of the twister approaching their home.
It sounded like a freight train or a jet engine revving up just in our backyard. It was amazing. I saw it, and I just didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if it was going to hit us, go around us. And I can remember everyone just being really, just kind of almost nauseous. You have absolutely no control over anything that's about to happen to you. And that's kind of a sickening feeling when you can hear it, and you just don't really know what to feel.
The approaching roar swallowed up the cries of Bobby and Cecilia Vaughn. The mother and daughter were now witnessing the storm's full fury. News helicopters continued to report as explosions and power flashes erupted throughout the city.
Jack, get us back on the air.
Even Channel 9 went off the air.
It's huge.
Images were coming in so quickly that Gary England and his weather team found it difficult to keep up.
It was a horrific day. I've been in this business 30 years, and I'd never seen anything like that. I always knew someday an F5 would come through the metro, but I had no idea. it would be that big and that vicious.
The F-5 continued its trek, leaving southwest Oklahoma City devastated. Of 50 brand new houses in the Szymanski's neighborhood, not one survived. John Szymanski was blasted 50 feet from his house. Now, he was desperately hunting for his missing wife. Storm tracker Val Castor was stunned by the devastation.
The damage was just incredible. I have never seen damage that bad before. There was well-built brick homes completely leveled, swept clean off their foundations. Cars were so mangled that you couldn't even recognize them. They didn't even look like a car. There was axles laying out in the road. There was bricks and parts of houses and boards and 2x4s, just all kinds of debris just strewn all across the countryside.
Cecilia Vaughn had survived the tornado unharmed, but her home had been completely destroyed. The only thing still standing in its original position was the bathtub she rode out the storm in. She quickly realized that her mother, Bobby, was nowhere in sight.
Dixie! I was praying that she was alive. When we were laying in the closet, I was trying to hold on to her. When the house got, blown away from around us, I wasn't able to hold on to her any longer.
I could hear boards breaking and glass crashing, and right after that, it got very quiet, and when I lifted my head up, everything was just gone.
In the 911 dispatch center, Frank Gresh tried to coordinate rescue personnel to the hardest hit areas.
People were calling on their cellular phones and didn't know where they were calling from because there were no more landmarks, there were no street signs, there were no houses, there were no house numbers. There was nothing there to help them identify where they were calling from and where we needed to send ambulances to get people the help that they needed.
As the tornado continued moving northeast, leveling the surrounding areas, emergency response crews moved into action. Knowing there were people who needed immediate medical treatment, off-duty paramedic Steve Sawyer ran throughout his neighborhood, trying to help in any way possible. He had run less than half a block from his home when he heard a woman screaming. She was standing in the remains of her home and pointing toward a mattress covered by bricks and wood. The woman told him that her little girl was trapped underneath.
You could hear her crying underneath. She was scared. And whenever we deal with kids, crying is a good thing. Crying means that they're breathing, their heart's beating. When they stop crying, that's when you got to worry about, okay, what happened? What's changed?
Sawyer checked for any injuries and handed the girl back to her still terrified mother. The tornado had passed within a couple of 100 feet of the Branscombs' untouched home. Scott knew there was an apartment complex nearby where there could be many more injured.
Dixie!
Across the region, desperate citizens searched for missing family members. John Szymanski finally located his wife, Dixie. When the tornado hit, its brute force blasted her from his grip, throwing her 70 feet into the neighbor's yard.
Help!
He didn't know if she was dead or alive.
As I got closer to her and I got some of the debris off the top of her, she wasn't responding to any of the questions I had for her, or when I was yelling her name, she wasn't responding at all to me.
Cecilia Vaughn continued to search for her mother. she found her buried under the remains of the bathroom walls. As Cecilia tried to get her free, Bobby lost consciousness. Within minutes after John discovered Dixie, a police car came through the neighborhood. The officer told him an ambulance was headed toward them. He helped John move Dixie out of the debris and onto the curb. Cecilia Vaughn's cries for help were finally answered by paramedic Steve Sawyer. She had survived the tornado, but her mother Bobby was buried under the rubble, unconscious. Sawyer could see that she was severely injured and close to death. He knew he had to get her to the hospital, and soon.
She was scared to death. To see her mom like that, it's a heartbreaking experience. To have a loved one, and all of a sudden, 5 minutes ago, you're sitting, talking, laughing, and then 5 minutes later, they're close to death.
Even if Steve Sawyer managed to keep Bobby Vaughn alive, he still had to get her to the hospital, which was 7 miles away. But emergency services were overwhelmed. Roads were blocked by debris, and thousands of people lay buried, waiting for help to arrive. On May 3rd, 1999, an F5 tornado ripped through the heart of Oklahoma City, destroying whole communities. Storm tracker Val Castor had driven over 80 miles pursuing the tornado and issuing reports to News 9's Gary England.
More debris, yeah.
As the tornado finally began to move away from the city, Castor realized the severity of the devastation around him.
I knew that I had to do my job and relay warnings, relay information back to Gary about the tornado. You've got friends and relatives that live all over Oklahoma City and more. So, yeah, I'm trying to do my job, but at the same time, I'm worrying about my friends and relatives, worrying how it's going to affect them.
In his own battered neighborhood of Greenbrier Lake in southwest Oklahoma City, Steve Sawyer was attempting to rescue Bobby Vaughn. She was very badly injured, her lungs filled with blood and fluid. Passing firefighters assisted him in removing the rubble from around Bobby and strapping her onto a backboard. Unfortunately, they couldn't help him transport her to the hospital. Sawyer was on his own.
I figured ambulances were coming. I figured there'd be more help coming. I didn't know the extent of the damage. I figured it was just our neighborhood.
Steve Sawyer was now in a race against time. He knew he wouldn't be able to help Bobby much longer. Miraculously, passing motorist Gary Miller stopped and offered them a ride to the hospital. Miller had been on his way to teach at a local college when the tornado struck. Now the professor helped Steve and Cecilia load Bobby onto his Jeep. With Sawyer kneeling over Bobby in the back, they took off. A stunned Gary England watched in disbelief as the tornado's rampage ended as suddenly as it had begun. The main storm dissipated shortly after crossing over the heart of Oklahoma City, but the terrible damage had already been done.
It looked like a war had been fought. There were areas where there was just a foundation left. There were cars that were the size of a small desk. Even as you looked at it, it was hard to say, my gosh, this happened, this moved through. How could anything do this?
Scott Branscombe had reached one of the worst-hit areas of Oklahoma City. The big tornado scored a direct hit on an apartment complex in Moore.
It was just completely leveled. There was boards and chairs and cars and you just clothes. It was unbelievable. I had never seen anything like that before in my life.
Branscombe drove half a mile from his home looking for survivors.
Hello, is anybody in here? Hello?
10 minutes into the search, he heard someone screaming. Scott reached down into the rubble and discovered an elderly woman lying on her back.
Okay, good. Okay. Hey, somebody!
He called out for assistance.
There's a lady inside here. We need to get her out.
As Scott and the rescuers moved the debris off the woman, they discovered that the walls had collapsed right on top of her. But she was partially protected by her walker.
When she had fallen down, that walker had fallen on top of her, forming a brace, keeping all of that stuff and that huge wall and all that debris from basically crushing her to death.
Finally, Scott Branscombe was able to lift the walker away. He placed a C-collar around her neck to keep it from moving.
She told me that she had been through 2 world wars, a depression, and 13 or so presidents, and she said, you just go ahead and pull me on out here. She said, I've been through worse.
He and the rescuers then laid her upon a piece of plywood and carried her to a staging area that had been set up in the middle of the street.
We could hear the sirens, obviously from all directions, because there's so many damaged areas, but we knew that they were on their way. They were going to be here as fast as they could, because people had cell phones and people had radios. So we knew they were on their way. We knew help was definitely coming.
Across southern Oklahoma City, thousands of citizens and emergency rescue workers were now combing through the debris and rubble, searching for family and friends. John Szymanski had managed to get an ambulance for his injured wife. Dixie was unconscious, clinging to life by the frailest of threads.
Just as the ambulance pulled up to treat Dixie, they advised me that they were going to treat the most serious patients first that they found in the addition. They began speaking with each other and they decided they were going to transport Dixie first. So I realized it was probably pretty bad at that time.
In the back of the ambulance, John Szymanski assisted paramedics as they tried to stabilize Dixie. She was unconscious. Her neck was broken. Blood seeped from her crushed face. John Szymanski feared the end might now be very close for his young wife. At Hillcrest Health Center, 100 injured survivors arrived in the first hour by any means possible. Dr. Dale Askins, head of emergency services.
We started receiving victims prior to the tornado hitting Oklahoma City because they were transporting them out of the communities south of us. So we were immediately aware we had a real disaster on our hands with the number of victims that started coming.
When she arrived, Dixie Szymanski was among those with the highest priority for immediate medical attention. John could do nothing more for his wife now, but wait for the doctors to tell him her fate. The supercells that created the F5 tornado continued to form dozens of new ones as the storm moved off to the northeast.
Find the basement in the building.
As night fell, the damage transformed the landscape of Oklahoma City into a surreal scene. Burning gas lines and houses illuminated the night sky. The Jeep with Bobby Vaughn wound its way to the hospital through piles of debris. Steve Sawyer was trying to keep Bobby alive. He knew his limited equipment would sustain her for only so long. He asked Cecilia for help.
I told her to assist her ventilations, and I also told her to talk to her. The last sense to go is your hearing. I knew that her mom was in there. We still had a good strong pulse at that time, but the respirations were dying.
With the sounds of chaos all around them, they navigated the nearly impassable roads, hoping they could get to the hospital in time. On May 3rd, 1999, a terrifying F5 tornado plowed into Oklahoma City. It was the most destructive tornado outbreak in U.S. history. Paramedic Steve Sawyer had rescued Bobby Vaughn from her home. Her condition was critical. Her daughter Cecilia hoped Professor Miller could get them there in time. Now, as they neared Hillcrest Hospital, it appeared their efforts were in vain. Bobby had stopped breathing.
As we got there, Steve jumped out of the back of the Jeep and started giving all the statistics on her that he could give, and they rushed her into the emergency room. But I knew she had quit breathing when they took her in.
The blast from the tornado had crushed Bobby under the walls of her home, knocking her unconscious. Her collarbone, nose, and several ribs were broken. Blood and fluid filled her lungs. She had stopped breathing.
She never regained consciousness, and I kept trying to get her to respond and telling her to hang in there, but she never did respond.
As the emergency room filled to capacity, Dr. Dale Askins had to deal with a growing list of physical as well as emotional medical conditions.
All these patients were psychologically traumatized as well as suffering their physical injuries. People were agitated, anxious, frightened, covered with mud. Virtually everybody was bleeding from multiple lacerations, punctures, that type of injury.
After an exhausting 4-hour search trying to locate survivors, Air Force Reserve medical technician Scott Branscombe got the word to return to Tinker Air Force Base. The enormous military facility narrowly escaped disaster as the tornado swerved at the last moment. In the tornado's aftermath, the military opened their arms to the local community, sending search and rescue teams into the tornado-damaged areas and providing food and shelter for survivors. Scott was assigned the duty of assisting many of the tornado victims. Thousands had lost their homes. Cecilia Vaughn got news that her mother would live. She'd gotten to the hospital just in time.
Even while she was in intensive care, every time she would wake up, she would ask where she was and what had happened, and we would retell the story of the tornado, and that she had a broken shoulder and broken ribs, and she just didn't have any recall of anything that had happened.
John Szymanski finally got to see his injured wife. Dixie barely recognized him, and she couldn't talk. Her broken neck was in a brace for 6 months. Doctors began a grueling marathon of 13 surgeries in an attempt to repair her shattered face.
I believe they had 160 stitches in her head, and that's the first time I got a chance to see her, and she was still covered in dirt and in blood.
4 days after the tornado, paramedic Steve Sawyer returned to work. But not before he paid a surprise visit to Bobby Vaughn.
It was a happy time, a real emotional happy time, because here we have someone that could have been left for dead, could have not been with their family today. And being able to be part of it was a good feeling, to know that, you know, I was able to help somebody.
In the aftermath of the May 1999 tornado outbreak, the federal government declared Oklahoma City and the surrounding towns a disaster area. Entire neighborhoods had been leveled. An estimated 10,000 residents were now homeless. 1 million cubic yards of debris littered a 27-mile corridor of destruction. Between 30 and 40,000 vehicles had been damaged or destroyed. Almost 800 people were injured. There were 44 fatalities. Incredibly, the death toll from the nation's most destructive tornado outbreak might have been worse. Meteorologist Gary England knows that people without protection from such damaging storms might not be so lucky again.
It might be in 1 year, it might be in 10 years, it might be in 50 years. It is going to happen again, and people will need somewhere to go. So people that don't have the plan, don't have the safe room, don't have the place to go, are at risk.
Both Dixie and John have healed from their injuries. In December of 1999, they moved into a new home. 1 year later, Dixie gave birth to a baby girl, Maya. To protect them all, they have added a special feature, a storm cellar. Dixie knows life is a gift.
And we're just lucky to be here and enjoy it as while we're here, because you never know when your time is.
The people of Oklahoma City have once again learned that lesson. It is a lesson for all of us. In the largest grain elevator in America, a spark causes dust to ignite and explode with terrifying intensity. Workers are severely burned and trapped inside the collapsed structure. When firefighters get the call, they know they are in for a fight.
My reaction was disbelief. I couldn't believe that there was that much destruction on that elevator.
The government declares it a national emergency. Family members pray for their loved ones, and medical personnel prepare for the worst.
Everything that we're going to need for that patient, we have ready.
Rescuers know that they must succeed, especially when seconds count. June 1998, almost harvest time in Kansas. Over the next 3 weeks, an entire season's wheat would be harvested and trucked to grain elevators for storage. Rising from the plains, the grain elevators are the largest man-made structures in the prairie states. There are 900 in Kansas alone. About 4 miles southwest of Wichita is one of the world's largest, a vast complex of 246 silos. They hold 20 million bushels, enough wheat to bake bread for every person in America for 6 weeks. Farm work is one of the most hazardous industries in America. Every year, almost 200,000 agriculture workers suffer disabling injuries. They are more likely to die on the job than workers in any other profession. But like many grain men, 37-year-old Scott Mosteller loved the work. He and his close friends Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen operated the elevator's nerve center. In the span of a few weeks, they would orchestrate the movement of more grain than many nations produce in a year. Inside, miles of conveyor belts and machinery process hundreds of thousands of bushels each hour. Machinery that must be maintained meticulously. With the upcoming harvest, workers were summoned to prepare machinery for what promised to be a bumper crop. Elaine Caldwell, an accountant, arrived with her husband Paul, who had been called back to work. 65-year-old Howard Going, who had retired the previous August, couldn't pass up a chance to work another harvest. Elaine Caldwell kept track of workers added to the payroll. Beneath the silos, wheat is constantly moving. This underground network of conveyor belts stretches nearly a mile. Conveyor belts pass over roller bearings. If even one of the 12,000 bearings in the complex seized up, it could overheat and cause a spark. One spark can be deadly. Grain dust, mixed in proper proportions with oxygen, can be as explosive as dynamite, 8 times more volatile than gasoline. Dangers were all around. A single spark can ignite the grain dust, causing a catastrophic explosion. In grain elevators, danger is ever present. Workers can be crushed by trucks or by freight trains. Massive, constantly moving machinery can sever limbs or crush hands. Even to get to their posts, some workers must ascend a vertical conveyor belt that rises 200 feet. Johnny Sutton, Scott Mosteller, and Lanny Owen work near the top of the head house, a 197-foot tall concrete tower that rises between the silos. Howard Going worked below, in tunnels 20 feet underground. Workers reach many areas of the elevators by a series of catwalks. One wrong step, and it's a 200-foot plunge to their deaths. The non-air-conditioned tunnels swelter at over 100 degrees on hot spring and summer days. But the biggest fear was fire. Workers checked and greased thousands of bearings to make sure none overheated and ignited highly explosive grain dust. But they missed one. At about 9:20 that morning, Howard Going heard a sound that made his heart stop. adjoining tunnel had seized and overheated, igniting grain dust. The initial blast set off a deadly chain reaction. The explosion shook up more grain dust, which ignited, setting off even larger explosions. Scott Mosteller heard it clang.
Hey, you guys, that didn't sound real good.
Worried, he looked down. He leapt to the floor, covering his face as a 2,000-degree fireball rocketed through the head house tower, blowing out the walls. A trucker picking up a load of grain heard the first muffled blasts. Moments later, the structure blew apart, destroying his truck and nearly blinding him. The explosion was so loud, it could be heard for 15 miles. Sedgwick County dispatcher Vanessa Downey was on duty that morning.
It was pretty quiet that day, just your normal car stops, banning vehicles, and then all of a sudden, boom. This guy called and says, oh my God, it's big. When he really couldn't say what had happened, all he knew is that the grain elevator had exploded. He said, you just can't imagine what it's like.
Sedgwick County Fire Chief Gary Kermode took the call from dispatch, but alarmed citizens flooded the lines.
We'd received about 110 phone calls within the first half hour, and then it kept continuing, and then it came in as a grain elevator explosion with people missing and or trapped.
6 fire stations and 2 rescue teams responded. Nothing prepared them for the devastation they saw. Lieutenant John Troyer, one of the first to the scene, recalls.
When the elevator first came into view, it was an amazing sight. You could tell there was large sections that were blown away. There was smoke rising. I couldn't believe that there was that much destruction on that elevator. And I turned to my lieutenant and I said, we're going to be here a very, very long time.
Inside the destroyed structure, workers dug themselves from the smoldering rubble. Elaine Caldwell suffered bruises, lacerations, and burns, but worried most about her husband at the top of the silo. She made her way out, stunned by what she saw. Other workers, staggered, burned, and bloody. Rooms that she had walked through moments before were unrecognizable, filled with smoke, flames, chunks of concrete, and twisted metal. When firefighters arrived, the area looked like a war zone.
We saw people running. We saw people kind of walking around in shock. We were concerned concrete and rebar that was hanging off the silos might collapse. We had 40 to 60 mile an hour winds, and so we still had a 3 to 4 foot movement of that, what we call the head house, where we think the explosion occurred, and that was moving about 3 to 4 feet too. So we had several considerations there to protect our rescue workers, number one, and get the people in the perimeter outside of that.
Fires continued to burn. Huge sections of the structure were in ruins, and some silos bulged out, the concrete riddled with massive cracks. The explosions had traveled the length of the complex, blasting out both ends. Grain continued to burst into flames, and debris continued to fall. After evaluating the risk, Chief Kermode coordinated rescue operations. Firefighters learned that several men were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below the ground.
Rescue, we divided into several areas. One was what we call the walking wounded, people that were injured, and we did a quick triage of those. And we sorted out the patients and determined which ones needed emergency help, less injured, those type of things. And we sorted them out by category.
In the head house, Johnny Sutton was badly burned. He radioed his position. A co-worker who escaped with minor injuries heard the transmission.
We're gonna try to get out of the head house.
Sutton helped dig out Lanny Owen.
Come on, we're gonna make it. Get out. Come on.
The walls around them shook and swayed. "18-inch slabs of concrete were pulverized. Scott Mosteller was blown to the back wall of the obliterated scale office. Mosteller was surprised that he was still alive.
A lot of times the top part of the head house is just gone completely, or it collapses. So I honestly, from the time it exploded, thought that was it. I felt pain over my whole body, and I was just trying to, since I'd never gone through anything like that before, I was afraid I was gonna pass out or go into shock.
Mosteller couldn't find his friends. To get out, he had to cross over mangled catwalks and collapsing sections of the concrete floor. When he reached a rooftop, he could hear sirens coming from miles around. Sutton helped Owen reach a spot where they wouldn't be crushed by falling girders or concrete. Elaine Caldwell pleaded for firefighters to find her husband on top of the massive complex. At the south end, Paul Caldwell lay injured and alone. Firefighters had to figure out how to rescue stranded workers from burning towers that looked close to collapse. Monday, June 8th, 1998, Wichita, Kansas. Firefighters responded to an explosion at one of the world's largest grain elevators. Grain dust ignited like dynamite, blasting through the structure. A series of massive fireballs destroyed much of the complex. Workers remained stranded on the still-burning towers. Others were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below the ground. People for miles around heard the blast. Dispatchers were flooded with calls. Among the first relatives to hear about the blast was Tom Mosteller, whose son Scott was stranded near the top of the concrete tower.
This is Tom, go ahead. The explosion had blown his hard hat off and his walkie-talkie off, but he had his cell phone inside his coveralls, his personal cell phone, and he didn't call until he got out to the top of one of the silos, and it was about 17 minutes after the explosion, so I said, I'll call you right back. I said, I've got to get a few things in motion, and I'll head that way.
Scott told his father that he was badly burned, but that rescue workers had arrived. By mid-morning, firefighters from Nebraska and Oklahoma arrived to help fight the blaze and rescue the trapped workers. Roads were blocked by panicked relatives trying to get to the scene. Sedgwick County deputies stopped them at a roadblock and did their best to keep them informed. But they kept coming. Authorities needed a place where family members and loved ones could gather to await news. Rescue workers directed them to a nearby elementary school that many of the workers' children attended. Grief-stricken family members gathered around the television, horrified by the images. Rescue personnel updated them each hour. The news was grim. Firefighters quickly found the bodies of 2 men killed by the blast. One victim's clothes had been almost completely blown off. EMT Bill Ochterlony helped treat the injured workers.
When we put together a triage area, we look at number of criticals and number of non-criticals. We try to divide those out into 2 separate groups. With the critical patients, we want to move those right away.
The burns had to be treated immediately. EMTs poured saline solution over sterile sheets to prevent potentially lethal dehydration. Rescue workers soon learned that 19 men were at the elevator at the time of the blast. Sections of the massive structure were destroyed or dangerously close to collapse. Fires continued to burn, and piles of wheat spontaneously burst into flames. Tom Mosteller managed to get through to the site and told firefighters he had spoken to his son by phone. His son, he told them, was badly burned, stranded near the top of the head house. Elaine Caldwell, an accountant injured in the blast, implored firefighters to search for her husband Paul, who had been working on the top of the silos. Trapped near the top of the head house tower, Johnny Sutton reached firefighters on his 2-way radio. Sutton told rescuers that he and Lanny Owen were injured on a rooftop near the scale office. Both were badly burned. Sutton also heard someone calling from the floor above. Firefighters now knew that at least 4 survivors were trapped in the concrete tower that rose between the silos. None of the departments in Kansas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma had ladders long enough to reach the top of the structure. Medical rescue organizations and even media outlets offered choppers, but Chief Kermode knew they wouldn't help.
Normally, helicopters are not always the best to use on a site. They have to be designed for it. They have to have a hoist. A lot of the media helicopters, they offered those helicopters to us. They offered us the Life Watch and Eagle Med helicopters to us. The problem is they're not designed to rescue people off buildings.
Desperate, rescue workers sought help from the Army Medical Unit at Fort Riley, Kansas. The unit, designed a set of mobile wartime hospitals, dispatched a rescue helicopter. At the burn center at Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, nurses and doctors monitored the rescue efforts, knowing victims would soon arrive. They prepared for the worst. Burn nurse Rhonda Young.
I knew from watching what was on TV that there were some significantly burned patients coming in. We have a very systematic approach. We start with what we call the ABCs. A is for airway, B is for breathing, C is for circulation. And you treat every patient the same way. The reason being is that you don't want to miss anything.
When the victims arrived, They suffered not only traumatic injuries caused by the violent explosion, but also life-threatening burns. The fireball scorched exposed skin instantaneously. Survivors were covered with gashes and bruises from flying debris. At 11:30, a combat rescue helicopter from Fort Riley's 82nd Medical Company arrived to help get the stranded workers. Paul Caldwell, alone at the far end of the complex, waved desperately to attract their attention. Crew members scanned the quarter-mile-long complex looking for survivors. Finally, they spotted him. Gusting winds made this rescue especially treacherous. Even under normal conditions, helicopter rescues required tremendous skill and coordination. If the pilot didn't maintain a steady altitude and position, the medic could slam into the structure with enough force to kill him. The hurricane-like prop wash could also transform chunks of concrete and metal into deadly projectiles. Elaine Caldwell watched, praying they could reach her injured husband. When she saw him rise, she was overjoyed. Paul Caldwell was critically injured. But he was alive. But other badly injured men remained stranded on the rooftops. The Fort Riley soldiers spotted Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen. But as the helicopter descended, prop wash caused concrete walls to sway and crack. Hope of a quick rescue was dashed. Fearing they would be crushed, Johnny Sutton waved them off. EMT Bill Ochterlony recalls.
Probably the most difficult part was the 4 men that were in the scale room at the top of the head house. We had radio contact with them, and they, over time, progressively got weaker.
Firefighters had to find a way to reach the injured men before time ran out. A deadly explosion at one of the world's largest grain elevators left desperate workers trapped on top of the burning structure. None of the fire stations in Kansas, Nebraska, or Oklahoma had equipment that could reach the top. A helicopter rescue was waved off when prop wash nearly knocked down concrete walls that would have crushed the injured men. But tenacious firefighters found another way. They commandeered a 175-foot crane that had been moving equipment at a nearby power plant. With stranded workers fading fast, firefighters feared they might arrive too late. Sedgwick County Fire Lieutenant John Troyer.
We had to move rail cars to get the crane in place, and then we needed to set up the crane, which of course had very large outriggers. And then to get the crews in place and brief them on what we needed done and to get them to the top took a long period of time.
Rescuers faced another nightmare in the smoldering bowels of the grain elevator. 4 men were trapped in tunnels 20 feet below ground. Rescuers needed to get them out. The tunnels were hot, well over 100 degrees, pitch black, and so choked with smoke and grain dust that breathing filters clogged in minutes. At any moment, grain dust could ignite, killing anyone inside. A dog from Kansas Search and Rescue was enlisted to help find the men in the massive complex. Built to withstand the pressure of millions of tons of concrete above, the tunnels now creaked and groaned as if they might give way, crushing everyone inside. Even a minor collapse would trap rescuers. The canine search got off to an ominous start. Trained search dogs communicate to their handlers with distinctive barks. This bark indicated that the dog detected human remains, not a survivor. Somewhere nearby, entombed beneath the smoldering rubble, lay another victim. In the head house, survivors worried that rescuers might not reach them soon enough. During the blast, Scott Mosteller had covered his face with his hands. His hands were so badly burned that the skin was charred. But they didn't feel hot. They felt ice cold. Tom Mosteller, who stayed in touch by cell phone, thought his son was showing classic symptoms of shock, a prime killer of burn victims.
He just said that he was very cold and he wanted to go to sleep. And I said, no, Scott, you can't go to sleep because we're going to need to communicate with you. We need to find out where you're at and what information you've got about the other fellows and this type of thing. And I said, so just don't go to sleep. I said, I'll just keep calling you, though.
At the base of the elevator, rescuers methodically cleared debris. And anchored the huge outriggers that would keep the crane from tipping over. Finally, they were ready. The crane hoisted the men more than 130 feet, the crane arm rocking in the gusting wind. The gargantuan concrete headhouse tower was almost destroyed. Sedgwick County Fire Lieutenant John Troyer.
The scene in there was amazing. 18-inch concrete with 1-inch reinforced rebar every 6 inches, and it was completely blown away. There was huge holes in the floors of the head house of the elevator, and the amount of destruction was just amazing. I mean, there was virtually nothing left. Huge cracks in the concrete floors, and making our way through there was dangerous.
Johnny Sutton feared he and Lanny Owen wouldn't last much longer. Lanny was in bad shape. When the explosion hit, he was looking down. His face took the full force of the 2,000-degree fireball. But moving even 20 feet put the lives of rescuers in jeopardy. Nothing was stable. Winds made the structure rock. At any moment, it could go down. By the time they reached Sutton and Owen, the men were weak and in agonizing pain.
Every part of exposed skin was burned to the 3rd degree. Of course, they probably had inhalation burns too, which is very, very serious and dangerous. We tried to get them out as quick as we could and also be safe.
Wind gusts had picked up. If they took one wrong step, they would plunge more than 100 feet into fires still burning below. They clutched Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen, moving methodically back to the crane. Rescuers hoped they had reached them in time. Tom Mosteller kept his son updated, filling him in on details of the rescue. But Scott's hands were shivering, and he was growing increasingly sleepy. The father assured his son help was on the way. He had to hang on. But the crane bucket was still at the silo tops, several floors below Scott. Rescuers had to scale part of the destroyed headhouse tower to reach him. Scott Mosteller feared that if he drifted off, he would never wake up.
I was afraid I was going to pass out or go into shock, so I just tried to stay awake. I looked down to see if my Jeep had been hit with any concrete, just anything like that to take my mind off of it.
From the command post below, Tom Mosteller and firefighters spotted rescuers emerging on the rooftop where Scott sat. To get Scott Mosteller back to the level of the crane's basket, firefighters had to use ropes and belaying gear designed to rescue mountain climbers. Scott Mosteller's burns were excruciating. The climbing ropes tore into burned skin. A medevac chopper was immediately dispatched. Like Johnny Sutton and Lanny Owen, Scott Mosteller was taken immediately to a waiting medevac chopper. All three men had lost massive amounts of fluids through their charred skin. They needed immediate medical attention. At Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, doctors and nurses knew it would be a long, hard struggle to keep these men alive. On June 8, 1998, doctors at the burn center at Via Christi St. Francis Hospital prepared to save the lives of badly burned workers plucked from the top of a grain elevator near Wichita, Kansas. The workers had been stranded for hours while rescuers struggled to reach them. Their horrific burns were encrusted with soot and debris, increasing the likelihood of lethal infections. With burns this serious, treatment should begin immediately. Their fight for survival had only begun. Burn nurse Rhonda Young was part of the treatment team.
The natural response physiologically to a burn injury is massive swelling. If they have facial burns, they're going to swell even more in the facial area. So that alone can compromise your airway. So you need to preserve that airway. That's an initial concern. That's a life-threatening concern. If you don't have an airway, you don't have a patient.
Dehydration can also be deadly. Fluid loss through burns can deplete the blood, depriving the brain and vital organs of oxygen. Lanny Owen, Johnny Sutton, and Scott Mosteller were all listed in critical condition. Even as they were treated, they asked about the men trapped in tunnels 20 feet below ground. The explosions left the tunnels clogged with wheat, mangled chunks of metal, and shards of concrete. The wheat itself posed a grave danger. It can engulf a man like quicksand. It also produces nitrogen dioxide, or silo gas, that can kill in minutes. Fires continued to smolder throughout the complex. Rescuers knew that another grain dust explosion could kill them all. but they remained hopeful after several rescuers reported hearing someone banging on a pipe. As the search intensified, Sedgwick County officials desperately needed help. That evening, the site was declared a national emergency. FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, dispatched a search and rescue team from Lincoln, Nebraska. The team included rescue specialists, physicians, structural engineers, dog team handlers, and more paramedics. Time was critical. If the workers had found air pockets in the mounds of wheat, they would have a limited supply of oxygen. Throughout the night, searchers combed the tunnels for any sign of life. FEMA brought truckloads of state-of-the-art search and rescue gear, including infrared cameras and super-sensitive listening devices. Using a slender pole-mounted camera, they searched beyond narrow crevices and mounds of wheat. Operators manipulated the camera with a joystick, watching on a small TV monitor. They found air pockets, but no signs of survivors. The tunnels were massive, dark, and smoky. Debris made more than 3/4 of them inaccessible. To conduct a thorough search, rescuers had to get the grain out. Structural engineers devised a way to keep grain from funneling down from damaged silos.
Come on, guys. Let's keep it going.
To stop the flow of wheat, they pushed sheets of plywood against the ceiling, blocking the silo's mangled release doors. 6-inch timbers held the plywood in place, like vertical beams in a mine shaft. They managed to clear hundreds of yards and reach parts of the tunnels that hadn't been searched. By daybreak, they had brought in massive vacuum trucks to suck out the grain. But hope began to fade when rescuers uncovered the remains of one of the workers. Later, they found 2 more bodies. The violent explosion had killed the workers instantly. They were too badly mutilated to identify. Relatives waited agonizing days for DNA test results, praying for their fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands. One by one, they were given the bad news. Only one man remained missing, 65-year-old Howard Going, who had worked at the elevator for 42 years. As they searched for him, Chief Kermode began to worry that they might lose one of their own.
There's always some danger in there, and that's what we look at when we weigh the benefit and risk ratio. If there's more benefit than the risk, then we'll go ahead and do that rescue.
The amount of damage discovered in the recently cleared tunnels made it unlikely that anyone could have survived the blast. While Howard Going's family waited for news, rescue officials debated whether to abandon rescue efforts altogether. Days after an explosion tore through one of the world's largest grain elevators, exhausted firefighters continued to fight the blaze and to search for survivors. At Via Christi St. Francis Hospital, doctors were in the midst of their own rescue operation, struggling to save the lives of critically burned men rescued from the top of the grain elevator. Burn nurse Rhonda Young witnessed the events firsthand.
When it's a mass casualty event, the trauma room is the big focus.
Even as doctors struggled to keep the men from dying of shock or dehydration, they evaluated the extent of the burns. Dr. Gary Jost, director of the Regional Burn Center, treated Scott Mosteller.
We were concerned about the extensive nature of burns to his hands, whether he would actually lose digits or how much damage would be long-term to tendons and joints. We elected to take him to surgery and graft the areas we thought were obvious third degree to the back of his hands.
The medical team administered massive doses of antibiotics to stave off life-threatening infections. They could only wait and hope that the skin grafts worked. At the grain elevator, investigators began to trace the path of the explosion. Although the elevator was filled with rubble, the investigators could reconstruct the blast by examining scorch patterns, warped metal frames, and tracing the trajectory of concrete that hung from rebar or was blasted into open fields. The rescue was growing increasingly hazardous. Because of 100-degree temperatures and heavy clothing, firefighters could only work an hour at a time. Falling debris and tunnel collapses put search teams in constant jeopardy. The investigators' preliminary findings confirmed rescuers' worst fears and forced them to make a decision they had hoped to put off. The first explosion occurred in one of the tunnels, where a seized bearing overheated, igniting grain dust. Within moments, a fireball blasted through the south tunnels, blowing out the ends. The explosion shot up the headhouse tower with astonishing force. Small explosions ignited more dust and transformed the metal doors and conveyor belts into shrapnel. A steel door from the bottom floor was tightly wrapped around a girder more than 100 feet high. The explosions traveled across the top of the structure, shaking dust, then igniting it, transforming silos into 130-foot-tall concrete rifle barrels. Howard Goyne never had a chance. Formal rescue efforts were aborted. His son, Robert Goyne, knew the firefighters would have continued rescue efforts if they had any remaining hope of finding his father.
You could just tell by looking at them, their actions, that was the hardest thing that they had to decide on, was to make it a search and recovery instead of a search and rescue operation.
The fire continued to burn as victims' families began to bury their husbands, sons, and fathers. One woman lost her brother and her husband. But the fire hadn't claimed its final victim. On Friday, June 19th, 11 days after the explosion, Lanny Owen died from his injuries. He left behind 2 children. Several weeks after the accident, recovery workers located the body of Howard Going. It took months for survivors to recover and rebuild their lives. Because of his burns, Scott Mosteller was unable to return to his job at the elevator. He did return to work, however, at the hospital that saved his life. Firefighters had to remain at the elevator for over a month, extinguishing grain that continued to burn. Few firefighters had ever worked such a massive catastrophe.
It was rated 6 out of 10 of the worst explosions in the world due to size of the structure, the economy, the cost factors. And when you sit back and look at it today, it was one heck of a challenge for any department, whether you're in New York City or whether you're Sedgwick County Fire District number 1.
Each year, firefighters hold a memorial service for the victims. A service that also commemorates their heroic efforts to rescue those who survived.